Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today we're going to take a look at the long list for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. So, if you don't know, the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction is my favourite literary prize. I have been reading along with it for years. It's a really great fun prize for historical fiction. I did a predictions video for the long list, so I'll leave that link down below because I talk a bit more about why I kind of love the Walter Scott Prize in that video. But the long list has been announced this morning. I haven't seen it yet. I have been studiously avoiding social media, although I did see like one headline pop up saying something about like the proportion of small presses and indie presses on the list, but that was the only thing I saw. I don't know what books are on the long list yet. So I'm going to have a quick look at the long list now, and then I will probably go away, do a bit more research about the books, check if my library has them, and then talk through my kind of reading plans. So let's take a look at the Walter Scott Prize long list. Oh, exciting. I guessed some correctly. Okay. Right, so 12 books on the long list this year. First up, we have The Heart in Winter by Kevin Barry, published by Canongate. Very excited to see this on the list. This was one of my predictions, and I have it on my physical TBR, and I've been meaning to get to it for a while, so very nice to have it on the list. Then we have The Catchers by Zan Brooks, published by Salt. Haven't heard of this book. I'll find out more about it for you in a second. Next, another one I haven't heard of, Mother Naked by Glenn James Brown, published by Peninsula Press. Clear by Caris Davies, published by Granta. That rings a bell to me, but it's not one that I have read. Next, we have The Mare by Angered Hampshire, published by Northodox Press. Again, not a book I've heard of, not a press I've even heard of, which is quite exciting. Here we have The Book of Days by Francesca Kay, published by Swift Press. So I didn't put this on my predictions list, but I have heard of it. I do feel like I heard quite a lot of good things about this in the last few months. Next, we have The First Friend by Malcolm Knox, published by Allen and Unwin Australia. Not one I've heard of, not 100% certain whether that's out in the UK or not, as it's Allen and Unwin Australia, but I will find out in a second. And next we have Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon. Yes, I'm so pleased to see Glorious Exploits on this list because, I just thought it was so good. It was so good. I finished Glorious Exploits last week. I think I mentioned in my predictions video that I was halfway through, and I have now finished it, and it was just excellent, top tier historical fiction. Kind of whatever happens, I want Glorious Exploits to win because it was so good. It was so good. Okay. Next we have A Sign of Her Own by Sarah Marsh. Oh, I'm so excited to see this on here. This was another one of my predictions, but because it's a debut novel, I didn't know how likely it was to make it onto the long list. But I'm really excited to see it on there. Very excited to read A Sign of Her Own by Sarah Marsh. That's published by Tinder Press. I can't remember if I said, but yeah, very excited to see that on this list. And then next, another one that I predicted. I'm feeling very proud of myself. The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller. I'm very excited to see this on this list. I haven't read it yet, but I read a previous book by Andrew Miller when it was on the Walter Scott Prize long list previously. Now We Should Be Entirely Free, and I loved that book. And ever since that book, I have thought to myself, really need to read some more books by Andrew Miller, and I haven't, so now is obviously the time. Then next we have Munich by David Peace, published by Faber, not a book I've heard of. Oh, interesting. Finally, we have The Safekeep by Yael van der Wooden, published by Viking. So I obviously have heard quite a lot about The Safekeep in the last year, or so. It has been quite hyped and very well received, and I was going to put it on my predictions list, and then I thought it wasn't eligible for the Walter Scott Prize, but I was obviously wrong about that. So I'm kind of excited to see that on the long list. I've heard lots of mixed things about The Safekeep, and I feel like it might be too literary for me, but I don't know. So yeah, I'm excited by that long list. I'm going to do a bit of more research in a second. But there's one book I've already read, Glorious Exploits, which I thought was incredible. And there are 4 books that I predicted. So I'm feeling very proud of myself, especially considering how obscure a list it is in some ways, like how many books there are from small presses. It's exciting that I managed to guess 4 books from the long list still, which I think is how many I guessed last year. So feeling very proud of myself. Right, I'm excited looking at all the covers and stuff. So let me go do some more research about these books, what they're about, where I can get hold of them. And I will check back in with you momentarily for you in an hour for me. and let you know my reading plans for the long list. Hello again. I've been away and researched all the books on the Walter Scott Prize long list and found out a little bit more about them and also whether my library has them, etc. And I've kind of worked out a sort of priority list, I suppose. So yeah, let me go through each book and tell you a little bit more about them, because I think I just only said the titles and the publishers before. So at the top of the list, the first book on the list is The Heart in Winter by Kevin Barry, which, as you can see, I have a physical copy of. This is the only one I have a copy of on my TBR, so this will be very high up my list. I got a proof copy of The Heart in Winter at a Canongate event last year, and I still haven't read it, but I have been meaning to, so the Walter Scott Prize is a good prompt to make me read it. So this book is set in the 1890s in Montana, and it's about a group of Irish immigrants living in the US, particularly about a poet and his love affair with a married woman. I've heard really good things about this, and it's also very short, so I know it's probably not going to take me very long. And I think I will hopefully pick this up very soon. During March on BookTube, we have the Irish Readathon. I'll leave some links down below about that. And Kevin Barry is an Irish writer, so I think this will hopefully be one that I'll read in March for the Irish Readathon. And yeah, very excited to get to this. Next on the list, we have The Catchers by Zan Brooks, which is a dual narrative set against the backdrop of the 1927 Mississippi flood, following a song catcher who is on the lookout for country music to sell to record companies and an exploited musician. So this sounds really, really interesting, and I always love books about music, which kind of pushes this up my list. And when I was looking into this book, I haven't heard of The Catchers, but I have heard of Zan Brooks' previous book, The Clocks in This House All Tell Different Times, which has an excellent title. And that one was actually longlisted for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction in 2018, which was the year before I started reading along with the prize. So even though I haven't heard of the new book, I have heard of Zan Brooks' previous one, which makes me curious. So this one is about 300 pages long, kind of relatively normal length for a book. My library doesn't have a copy, but maybe I will try and get hold of one. We will see. Then next we have Mother Naked by Glenn James Brown. What a wild cover. Like, what an absolutely wild cover. I kind of love it. And this book is set in Durham in 1434, and follows what happens when an aging minstrel turns up at Durham Cathedral to entertain the most powerful men in Durham. This minstrel is called Mother Naked and has come to tell a ghost story relating to a murder that took place in a local village 40 years before. But the book is also set against the backdrop of the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt. And this sounds great. This sounds really, really good. I think partly the wildness of the cover is making me curious, but also it's set in Durham and in Durham Cathedral, and as I spoke about plenty when I was reading along with the Walter Scott Prize last year and read Cuddy, which, you know, remains one of my absolute favourite books. I love a book set in Durham. I went to university there. I know the cathedral and like the city really well. And so there's something really lovely about reading a book set there. So that sounds really great. I really want to read this. And it's quite short as well. I think it's like 250 pages. My library doesn't have a copy, but this does sound great, so I definitely want to try and get to this. Next we have Clear by Caris Davies, which is set in 1843 on a remote Scottish island, and this looks at a rebel minister who is desperate for money after breaking away from the Free Church of Scotland, and he agrees to assist in the Highland clearances. So he ends up travelling to a Scottish island in order to try and move on and evict a man called Ivan who is living there, and basically the novel is about these two men trapped on this island together for a month, which sounds really, really interesting. Again, sort of interesting to see themes between Walter Scott Prize longlist from year to year. Last year I read Music in the Dark by Sally Magnuson, which was also about the Highland clearances, and was fantastic. So I'm kind of even more interested in this topic now, and I'd be really interested to read Clear by Caris Davies. I also thought the name sounded kind of familiar, and then when I was looking up Caris Davies online, I realised that I have read something by Caris Davies before, which is a short story in this collection called Red Room, which is short stories inspired by the Brontes, and there's a short story in here by Caris Davies, and I read this probably like nearly 10 years ago. So that's kind of fun. I was having a look to see whether or not my library had a copy of Clear, and my library does indeed have a copy of the audiobook. So it looks like Clear is very, very short. I think it's only about 160 pages. And in fact, the audiobook is only 3 hours long. So I'm definitely going to read this because it's so short. I've already got the audiobook out from the library, and I might read it before the end of February, to be honest, because that's so short. I'll see. I'm curious. This sounds really intriguing, and yes, very short. Then next on the list we have The Mayor by Anne Reid Hampshire. So this looks like it's a novel based on a true story, but like very, very heavily based on a true story. Like, it's interesting, you know, when you read the blurbs, the summary, the description of what a book is about. For a fiction novel, they're always in present tense, but for non-fiction, they're usually in past tense. And the description of this book on Like Waterstones was in past tense, which makes me think that on the scale between non-fiction and fiction, it is quite a way towards non-fiction. But it is also described as a novel, so I'm not sure. Anyway, it looks like this book looks at the true story of a woman who was one of the female guards in the Nazi concentration camps, who later fled and lived in the US and sort of hid her past for a long time. And I think this book is kind of about that story. This sounds really interesting, but also very grim and probably quite disturbing. My library doesn't have a copy or anything like that, so I'm not 100% certain whether or not I'm likely to get to this one, but we will see. Next, we have The Book of Days by Francesca Kay. So this novel is set in 1546 and follows the story of a woman called Alice whose husband is dying, and his kind of like dying wish, his obsession on his deathbed is the building of a chapel in his local church. But the book is also set against the backdrop of the Reformation, and kind of looks quite a lot at religion, as well as apparently themes of nature. I have heard some good things about this one. I am kind of interested to read it, but it's probably not like really, really high up on my list. I think from the sort of time period and the description, it doesn't necessarily sound like one I'm as keen to read. I think it sounds like a slightly quieter book, and sometimes the more sort of like literary, reflective, less plot heavy books are slightly less for me. Sometimes I want a bit more plot. Maybe that's completely wrong, but I don't know. Maybe that's a misjudgment of the book. But yeah, I think it's about 300 pages, not too long. My library doesn't have a copy, but I will see. Again, probably one of those ones where if it makes a shortlist, I will definitely read it, but if it doesn't, I'm not sure. Next, we have The First Friend by Malcolm Knox. So this novel sounds fascinating. So this is apparently a chilling satirical comedy set in the Soviet Union in 1938, looking kind of at like Stalin as a gangster mob boss in charge of a global superpower. Like, that's the kind of framing of Stalin within it. But we're specifically focusing on like a local leader in Georgia and his oldest friend, and kind of like how far they'll go to protect their families. This sounds great, and the cover is wild. I'm kind of enjoying the many humorous covers we have within the Walter Scott Prize this year. Like The First Friend, Mother Naked, and Glorious Exploits, which we'll talk about in a minute, all have quite like playful covers, and that kind of like satirical look at history is something I quite enjoy, and I am really interested in Russian history. So The First Friend sounds really, really fantastic. I feel like it would be right at the top of my list, except that it's published by Allen and Unwin Australia, and it's not out in the UK. So basically, unless the Walter Scott Prize publicity team can send me a review copy, which they might be able to do, but unless they can, I have absolutely no way of getting hold of this book. So we'll see, but I really want to read it. Doesn't that just sound great? Okay, then next on the list is Glorious Exploits, which I've already read and spoken about. Ferdy and Lennon's debut novel that was just like supreme. It was so good. I'm excited that it's on the Walter Scott Prize longlist. I feel like once I've read another book from the longlist, I'll make a dual review and talk more about how incredible I thought Glorious Exploits was. So this book is set in Sicily in 412 BC after a failed invasion of Sicily by the Athenians. There are now thousands of Athenians imprisoned within the quarries of Syracuse. These Athenian prisoners of war have more or less been left to rot, and then two out-of-work Sicilian potters, one of whom is obsessed with Athenian theatre, decide they're going to put on a play using the Athenian prisoners of war as actors. And this book is like, oh, it's so good. I really recommend the audiobook especially. I listened to the audiobook and it was so fantastic, because one of the many, many clever things about this book is that Ferdia Lennon writes it in a really like Irish style. The speech patterns of the language that the Sicilians use is very Irish, and it's just this incredible novel about the messiness of power dynamics, about the complexities of people, about how war teaches people to dehumanize other people, and it's just incredible. Like, it's just so good. It's so good. I know there are 11 books on this long list that I haven't yet read, but I feel like it would take something very, very, very impressive indeed to make me not have Glorious Exploits as my choice of winner. I just think Glorious Exploits was truly one of the best works of historical fiction I've ever read. Next on the list, though, a book I'm really excited to read is A Sign of Her Own by Sarah Marsh. So this novel is set in the 1870s in the US, and we're following Ellen Lark, who is soon to be married when she receives an unexpected visit from Alexander Graham Bell. Ellen is deaf, and years ago she was a student of Alexander Graham Bell's looking at a technique called visible speech. And back then, Bell confided in Ellen his ideas about the telephone, and now that his patent claims are being challenged, he needs Ellen's help. But she also has her own story to tell about his betrayal of her. This sounds like such a fascinating book. I've been really, really excited to read it for ages. It was one of my anticipated books for 2024. I just really want to read this book. It's very exciting to see it on this list. My library doesn't have a copy of this one, but I'm so excited to read it, and I've been meaning to read it for such a long time that I might just buy myself a copy, because I do really want to read it, and I feel fairly confident that I'll like it. It seems very, very much like my kind of book. So hopefully I will get to that one soon. Next on the list, we have The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller, which is set in 1962, which was apparently a really, really terrible cold winter in the West Country. And this book is set in the West Country, following various different characters, one of whom is a young man who I think is contemplating suicide while staying in an old asylum. And then we're also following two married couples who are both snowed in and find their lives kind of unraveling. This sounds really, really intriguing. As I said earlier, I've read a book by Andrew Miller before, Now We Should Be Entirely Free, and I loved that one. I will say that The Land in Winter sounds like a slightly quieter, less plot heavy novel than Now We Should Be Entirely Free, but it also sounds really, really intriguing. And I did love Now We Should Be Entirely Free so much, so I am excited for this one. My library also has a copy, so that's nice and easy. I will probably get this one out in March or April and have a read. Next on the long list is Munich by David Peace. So this novel is set in the late 1950s, maybe the early 1960s, and looks at the rebuilding of the football team, Manchester United, after several of the team players were killed in an aeroplane accident at Munich airport, which is a real historical event. And I think this book looks at the lives of those who survived the crash, maybe the lives of those who died in it as well, and kind of how this event changed football. So my library does have a copy of this book, so it would be relatively easy for me to get hold of. It is, however, nearly 500 pages. I think it's the longest book on the long list. And I have so little interest in football. Not just I have zero interest in football, I have -10 interest in football. And, I do think sometimes a novel that is about a particular thing is also not necessarily about that particular thing. Just because the book is thrown around football, that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be a super football heavy book. And also, I remember reading Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which has a lot about surfing in it. And I remember reading that and thinking I have zero interest in surfing, but when Taylor Jenkins Reid writes about it, I'm there. And also because surfing is used to explore the character relationship. So, maybe there would be a lot in Munich for me to like, but because of how little interest in and understanding I have of football, that does make me less inclined to read this one. So I feel like this is probably one where if it makes the shortlist, I will read it, but if it doesn't, I probably won't. But we will see. We will see. Finally, the last book on the long list is The Safekeep by Yael van der Voorten. So this novel is set in 1961 in the Netherlands, and looks at, I think, kind of the aftermath of the Second World War, but we're kind of focusing on the relationship between a woman called Isabel and her brother's new girlfriend Eva, who unexpectedly comes to stay for the summer. So I have heard a lot about The Safekeep. I feel like, probably other than Glorious Exploits, which obviously I've now read as well, I feel like The Safekeep is probably the book on the long list that I've heard the most about. And I feel like the reaction to it has been quite mixed. A lot of people really, really love it, but a lot of people don't. And I think also the novel's different parts are quite different, and some people don't like different parts of the book. I've definitely heard that. I gather it's pretty literary. I do kind of wonder if it's going to be a bit too literary for me, but we will see. My library has this, and in fact it has it on audiobook as well as physically, so I might listen to the audiobook. I think especially if I'm kind of thinking it might be a little bit too literary for me, then the audiobook might be best. I do tend to find that if a book is slightly more literary, I have a bit more like patience for that on audiobook, especially if the kind of writing style is quite experimental. I'm not sure that it is, to be honest. I feel like I've heard the form is slightly experimental, maybe. I'm not sure, but anyway, I don't know, but I might listen to the audiobook of this one. It wouldn't necessarily be absolutely top of my list, but it is relatively easy for me to access, so hopefully I will read this one soon. So there we go. Those are the 12 books on the Walter Scott Prize long list. I've read one so far. I have 11 to go, although I probably don't, because, you know, what happens most years with me reading along with the Walter Scott Prize is I read the whole shortlist, but I don't necessarily read all of the long list. Although I do feel that's often because there are usually a couple of books that are follow-ons or sequels, parts of series in the long list, which there aren't this year. So maybe I will read the whole long list, but I think it's probably unlikely. I think I'll probably read between 8 and 10 of them, and that is fine. So the long list was announced today when I'm filming this, a couple of days ago by the time you see this video probably. The shortlist will be announced on the 15th of April, and then the winner will be announced on the 12th or 13th of June. So 2 months until the shortlist is announced, 4 months until the winner is announced. That's plenty of time for me to read several of these books. So top of my list are The Heart and Winter, definitely. Obviously, I already have a physical copy of that one. Clear by Karis Davies, which I've already got out of the library and is very, very short. That's also very high up on my list. I'm really, really keen to read A Sign of Her Own because I think that sounds great. And I also do really want to read The Land and Winter because Andrew Miller is an author who I know and like, and that also is at my library, so that's quite easy to get to. Then probably like next on my list, like the next few priorities, I think Mother Naked sounds really interesting, if I can get hold of a copy, and The First Friend as well. I really want to read The First Friend, and I am sad that it's not out in the UK, but you know, maybe I'll be able to get a review copy, we'll see. And then I suppose The Safekeep would probably be relatively high up on my list as well because I can listen to the audiobook from my library and I have heard so much about it. And then whether I get to the books beyond those, we will see. I will see what I have time for, what I can get hold of, and also what ends up on the shortlist in 2 months' time. So that's all for now. Do let me know down below in the comments, have you read any of these books? Have you heard of any of these books? What are your thoughts? Are there any you think I really need to get to really soon? Have you read Glorious Exploits? Isn't it great? Yeah. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.